Great. Thank you, Julia. Give me just a second to pull up PowerPoint slide here. So I will start off this webinar with sort of more traditional content where I'm just like speaking at you about some recent publications in the geosciences, either summarizing numbers about who is actually getting graduate degrees in the geosciences and perspectives on how we can address the lack of diversity. And then we're going to have an open forum. So let me just go to the overview here. Sorry, just a second. Dogs barking. Okay, so I just want to go, I'm going to jump to this third bullet point here first so I can make this announcement that we want as many people to participate in the second part of this webinar, which is actually an open forum. And since the way that this forum or the Zoom meeting is set up is that you can't actually speak up and talk with all of us unless you're added as a participant to the Zoom. So in order to participate in this forum, you just have to send a direct chat message using the chat function to Julia Masterman, and she can add you as a participant, and that will allow you to actually get involved in this forum. And you'll be hearing from other people besides me at that time to sort of kick off the discussion. I've invited other people to sort of talk about their efforts and perspectives on DEI. And that includes Tree Dada, Kate Hale, Vicki Dutch, and Alan Rempel, and they're all here to give sort of brief discussions and sort of get the discussion started. I'm really grateful for them for becoming involved. And so I'm going to start with some definitions here and then sort of a view of where we're at. So numbers and perspectives on DEI and the geosciences. So I just want to say, again, I'll bring this back up at the end, but again, if you want to participate in the discussion, whether you have a perspective or an idea, or you just want to be involved in this forum, send a chat message to Julia and she'll add you. Okay, so I think it's important that we just sort of define these terms, and this might not be new to you. I'm not sure, and I didn't want to make any assumptions about where anyone was coming from. And so in order to have a discussion about these things, I think it's really important for all of us to be on the same page about what they mean. And I'll just preface this by saying I'm not a DEI expert by any means, but I think one sort of strength I can bring to this is, sort of skills that I've learned over time and sort of organization or summarizing things. So this is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. And I just wanted to recognize that I am not a DEI expert, but I'm going to do my best in sort of bringing some information to you guys to sort of get this kicked off. So diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting. And a lot of times we talk about in terms of race and gender specifically, but it's much broader than that. It could be ethnicity, religion, or worldview, nationality, sexual orientation, sort of all of these things that make us who we are, and we're all different from each other. And these are identities that create advantages and barriers to opportunities and resources. And I think it's important to recognize that it's both of those. Certain groups get advantages, and then other groups get barriers. And diversity in and of itself is not, and it's not about any one individual. So it always sounds silly to me when somebody says like a diversity hire, because it's not about any one individual, but it's about a collective or a group and how individual identities exist in relationship to each other. And I would encourage you to just take a moment and think about the diversity of your own workplace or department or your lab or research team or organization, and think about what it's like. Do you consider it diverse or not diverse? So then inclusion is about those with different identities or feelings being valued in that workplace and being welcomed. So one quote that I think is helpful, although it's not perfect to describe this, is that diversity is being asked to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. So you can have a diverse workplace, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's inclusive. And it's particularly regarding those with marginalized identities. Do they feel valued? Are they given opportunities to grow? And do they get support from their mentors and advisors? And so again, I would encourage you to think, what's the experience of individuals within your organization, and what barriers stand in the way of people with different identities feeling a sense of welcome and belonging. Okay, and then equity then is everyone gets access to the same opportunities. So equity recognizes that these advantages and barriers for different identities exist, and that as a result, we're not all starting from the same place. And equity is a process that begins by acknowledging that unequal starting places exist, and it's a commitment to correct and address those imbalances. So it can be helpful to think of diversity and inclusion as outcomes. Teams can be diverse and they can all feel supported, whereas equity is an ongoing process that organizations engage in to provide opportunities to all. And again, I encourage you to think, and this one's not as easy of a question, but can you identify your own biases that would impact you sort of carrying out equity? And maybe you're not yet in a position of leadership, but all of us have biases, and that could impact equity in our workplaces or labs. And then if you can identify your biases, have you learned or sought out information that you need to make your group or lab or organization more equitable? So can you recognize those biases or biases in others that might exist, and then actively seek out ways to address those? So now that that's defined, I just wanted to go over the numbers, and I think, we probably all know this, but the geosciences, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, is incredibly white. And there was this paper in 2018 that I think is really helpful in summarizing these numbers. And it summarized it by starting with the number of PhDs by subfield, breaking it apart into Earth, ocean, and atmospheric science, and then looking at all of those combined and looking at the number of graduates, PhD graduates by race and ethnicity. And really, the outcome of this is that consistently over time, over the last 4 decades, almost 90%, 85 to 90% of PhD recipients have been white, non-Hispanic. So there's really the numbers to back it up. The geosciences really lacks diversity, and that there hasn't been any advancement in diversity over the past 4 decades. So I encourage you, if you're interested in digging into these numbers a little bit more, to seek out this paper and read a little bit more into the individual components of these numbers and summary statistics. Sort of a bright spot in the data, potentially, and depending on which field you look at, is that the gender gap has actually been closing over the last 4 decades. So the percentage of women earning PhDs has steadily climbed in all of the 3 subfields within the geosciences. While a gender gap is still present in the atmospheric sciences, alternatively in the oceanic sciences, the number of women has actually surpassed the number of men receiving PhDs since 2009. So there are still more men getting PhDs than women in the geosciences, but that gap has significantly closed over time. And sorry, this is a lot of text, but this content is hard to sort of liven up with pictures, and I think it's important to sort of get these numbers out here. So in 2016, only 6% of geoscience doctorates were awarded to underrepresented minorities. Consistently within the whole US population, that group made up 31% of the US population. So we're not matching in the geosciences what the broader population looks like. And, even more depressingly, the geosciences have the lowest proportion of doctorate recipients from underrepresented minorities among all STEM fields. So if you look at other science and engineering fields, 13% of doctorates went to underrepresented minorities, more than twice done in the geosciences. So no matter where you look, we're still a long way from adequate representation compared to broader populations within the US. The change in gender balance definitely shows a trend in the right direction, but there's still room for improvement, and that varies sort of by field, subfield that you look at. But I think it's particularly important to note that women of color are particularly underrepresented. So between 1973 and 2006, the numbers are bleak. You can count them, in less than hundreds, so there's been 69 Black and 241 Hispanic or Latino women that received PhDs in all 3 geoscience subdisciplines. They make up a mere 330 or less than 2% of all doctorates awarded in over 40 years. So I just think that this quote is pretty important here. As a geoscience community, we can't afford to miss out on the extraordinary talent that exists within currently underrepresented minority groups. And we're limiting the science that we do if we don't become more inclusive, and we need to do better. And this is a direct quote from this Nature Geoscience paper. Okay, so another paper that recently came out also in Nature Geoscience, sort of this related series, is about race and racism in the geosciences. And this is a perspective on sort of what's happening in the geosciences. And broadly, I think it's easy to say the less diverse a field, the less welcoming it is to minorities, and the more prevalent implicit biases become, the less inclusive your workplace or group can become. So combined with the structural and social factors, the relative homogeneity in geosciences reinforces the dominant culture. And as a result, women and people from sexual and gender minorities and Black, Hispanic people all leave the field at higher rates than the average student or practitioner. And then we can define this term colorblind racism to describe the declaration that someone simply does not see color, denoting a subtler form of racism than overt racism. So many white people who are not aware of or who deny having any racist tendencies unwittingly engage in it. Although this isn't intentional, disregarding race in a setting with strong imbalance in power, as is the case in many US geoscience departments, reinforces race being viewed as by default from a perspective of being white. So race and prejudice are distinct in that racism denotes a systematic advantage that benefits a dominant group such as white people, whereas prejudice suggests individual bias. So I think it's important to recognize the difference between those. And, I think we can all recognize that implicit racism is deeply embedded in the US society, and that geoscience culture is no exception. And not acknowledging this bias means that the realities of people of color are dismissed, often by obliviousness rather than out of malice. So it's no intent, but rather sort of a lack of action. And focusing on diversity without inclusion makes marginalized groups feel that they merely serve as a diversity statistic, and that their voices and experiences don't count. So I think then that it's pretty important to recognize that hurdles exist literally at all levels. So it starts when students begin pre-university, and it continues through graduate school. And I think one of the biggest things is that, the stereotype of a geoscientist is sort of a white man. And it's compounded by the perception that geoscience is an outdoors only activity, and that can be discouraging because natural environments are less accessible to children from urban settings and children from low income households. Even though a lot of us engage or in this field because we love the outdoors or we love the mountains, it's not necessarily a reality that's acceptable to all. And a career in postgraduate geoscience research might not be seen as, the most financially secure of all options. If they're thinking about, going into medicine or engineering, it's maybe a little bit riskier in terms of financial security. And certainly, what grad students get paid doesn't help that. And underrepresented groups are less likely to be accepted into these programs, even if they're interested in applying to them and making less money over their graduate time in graduate school. That first, the application process is not straightforward or necessarily welcoming, and then they're less likely to be accepted relative to their white or white male applicants that they are going up against. And then additionally, fieldwork requirements create barriers to ethnic minorities for reasons including cultural sensitivities, cost, inclusivity, and racial harassment. And then additionally, and this is something that's been getting a lot more attention recently, and is sort of attention at higher institutional levels, is that there's this alcohol culture in many geoscience departments, and not just departments, but also conferences, and sort of it's this broad culture. And that's really a barrier to inclusivity for students who don't drink or don't want to drink in a professional setting. So there are potential actions, and again, these are some of them that I have taken from the literature, and I've included citations for all of these papers, and I have another slide for resources, but this is not intended to be all encompassing, but just things that I found helpful as sort of, bullet points. These things are not, they're not simple, they're not easy, they're not quick, but some potential actions to address some of these hurdles that exist is, one, there's been a growing demand for academia to contend with its colonial links and institutional whiteness, and this is broadly referred to as decolonization. So the relationship of field-based disciplines like geosciences are with the land has typically taken a colonial approach of white Western field sciences building or visiting a location, removing samples. Typically, they get the help of local people, but then they extricate this knowledge and they publish it in paywalled Western journals, often without co-authorship by the local people that helped them actually retrieve those samples. So this is a larger issue that can be hard to recognize if we are the ones that are actually going out and doing this field work or collecting samples or going to other places, thinking that we're doing a broader benefit through our science, but we also have to recognize how that could be seen by other locations, and our sort of sense of owning everything is a disservice to science and the geosciences broadly. Another potential action would be inclusive teaching. And it's such a broad term, but I think a lot of the way that the geosciences is represented in teaching doesn't make underrepresented groups feel like they would be welcome in participating in the geosciences. Representation, in order to know that you can do something, it's helpful to be able to see other people that look like you doing that thing. That lowers the hurdle and the barrier to get into that field or subfield of geoscience that you're interested in. And then other ones are subject awareness, removing barriers, and effective long-lived initiatives. And these are all, easy to say, but very difficult to do. And I think just one example of effective long-lived initiatives that's been attempted is the National Science Foundation has broader impacts, and they implemented broader impact statements and the broader impact program more than 20 years ago, and yet we have not seen an improvement in diversity in the geosciences since they implemented that program. So, what is it that makes effective or makes these long-lived initiatives effective or not effective? And so it's a little more difficult when there have been efforts that have been ongoing to try to increase diversity, that clearly have been limited in their effectiveness since we haven't seen an increase in diversity in the geosciences over the last 4 decades. And so, that's maybe part of the discussion today is, what's effective and what's not effective. And I certainly did not mean to scoot past that important slide. Since I said that I was not an expert in this, I wanted to give everybody some resources to follow up or to look more, to read more deeply, because part of the solution is to be aware of any implicit biases that you might have, and a part of addressing that is actually reading up on the literature and getting familiar with other people's perspectives. And sometimes a light bulb turns on and be like, oh, I've seen that, or maybe I've done that, or I'm aware of this. And I think one of the sites or efforts that has been really helpful for me, particularly, is URGE, Unlearning Racism in the Geosciences. And I have the link here. They have modules, including readings that you can go through. And then they also have a list of resources, and also there are pods. So URGE pods can exist. Maybe there's one at the institution that you're in, or maybe you're interested in starting a pod. And so that's a great resource. And then I'm including some other ones that are specifically for the polar sciences. And I'm doing this, and I have invited some people to speak about efforts in the polar sciences, in part because in the snow hydrology community, well, certainly there have been efforts to put out letters recognizing lack of diversity and saying that we'd like to have efforts to increase diversity in snow science and hydrology. The actions have lagged behind a little bit some of these other communities, and certainly we would like to address that. But we're learning from other efforts. So there's the Polar Impact Network and Diversity in UK Polar Science. And then also I just wanted to highlight there is an AGU EOS series on diversity with a link of articles that are included within that series. And I would encourage you, if you know of others, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list at all. If you know of other resources that could help people or maybe have helped you learn, please drop them in the chat, because this is really, just kind of my perspective. And I certainly don't know of all the resources that are out there. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here.